My father built his company from nothing, and I never imagined that the woman who called me daughter for 9 years was quietly filling it with her own eyes and ears. I'm Rachel, and this is the story of how I found out that my marriage was never really a marriage. It was a slow, patient business acquisition, and I was just the paperwork that made it legal. My father Thomas started his logistics company out of a rented garage when I was 12 years old, and he worked 18-hour days, so he missed birthdays. And he missed my school plays, but he built something real, and by the time I turned 26, that garage had become a company with 400 employees and contracts across 3 states. When I met Daniel at an industry dinner, I thought it was fate because he was charming and he asked thoughtful questions about my father's business, and he seemed genuinely interested in me, not just in what my last name meant, so we dated for a year. And when he proposed, his mother Linda cried tears of joy and hugged me so tightly that I remember thinking, I finally have a mother figure in my life again, since my own mother passed away when I was 16. Linda was warm and she was generous, and she sent me flowers on my birthday. And she called just to check in, and she told me stories about Daniel as a little boy, so she made me feel like I belonged somewhere. And looking back now, that warmth was the perfect disguise. After the wedding, Linda started suggesting people for my father's company because small suggestions came first, like I knew a wonderful accountant he used to work for my brother's firm, or there's a young man brilliant with logistics software. He needs a chance, and my father, being trusting and kind, hired almost everyone she recommended since he thought he was doing his new-in-law family a favor, and he thought it was just Linda being generous with her network. Over the next 6 years, 27 employees connected to Linda's family, or her friends, or her former colleagues, or even a cousin twice removed, were placed across my father's company in accounting and in operations and in human resources and in shipping logistics, because they were spread out carefully and never clustered in one department, and never obvious, just quiet, capable people who did their jobs well and kept mostly to themselves. I didn't notice because why would I when my father trusted his son-in-law's family completely? So Daniel and I had a daughter, Emma, and life moved forward the way life did, since I was busy with motherhood and my father was busy running a growing company, and Linda was busy being Linda. The cracks started small when my father began losing certain contracts to competitors that he should have easily won because the bids were somehow always undercut by a fraction of a percent right before the deadline, so he assumed it was bad luck or a leak somewhere in the industry grapevine, and he never once suspected his own company. Then came the moment I remember with painful clarity, when it was a Sunday dinner and Emma was 4 years old, and Daniel casually mentioned a business deal my father was working on, which was a deal my father had told me about in strict confidence just 2 days earlier, because Daniel knew details he shouldn't have known, like the exact numbers or the client's hesitations, or even a private comment my father made in a closed-door meeting. I asked him how he knew, and he laughed it off, saying, small industry, everyone talks, but something inside me went cold. A feeling I couldn't name yet, just a quiet unease that sat in my chest for weeks. The unraveling truly began when my marriage started falling apart on its own, not because of any business scheme, but because Daniel had been unfaithful twice, and the second time I found out, I stopped pretending, so I filed for divorce, and that decision, which was the hardest one of my life, became the key that unlocked everything I never knew. During the divorce proceedings, financial records had to be disclosed, like bank statements and business interests and family assets, and buried in documents that neither Daniel nor Linda expected me to ever request. I found a spreadsheet that wasn't labeled anything dramatic, just contacts, but when I opened it, I found 27 names with dates of hire and departments, and next to each name, a small note about what information they had access to. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning while Emma slept upstairs, and I read through 6 years of quiet betrayal because my father's payroll director had been feeding hiring and salary information for years, and a shipping coordinator had been logging every major client relationship, and someone in accounting had access to profit margins that competitors somehow always seemed to match. I called my father the next morning, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone, so I said, Dad, I need you to sit down. When I showed him the spreadsheet, I watched a man who had never once raised his voice in front of me go completely silent because he stared at the names for almost 10 minutes without speaking. Then he said one sentence that broke my heart. "I trusted them because I trusted you." We hired a private investigator and an attorney who specialized in corporate espionage, and what we found was worse than either of us imagined because Linda hadn't just placed people to gather information, but she had been quietly steering my father's company for years by feeding details to a rival logistics firm owned by an old family friend in exchange for what I still don't fully understand. Maybe money, or maybe influence, or maybe simply the satisfaction of control, since some people don't need a reason to manipulate, they just need an opportunity. The confrontation happened 3 weeks later inside my father's office when Linda arrived, expecting a friendly conversation while still playing the role of the warm, loving mother-in-law, and she sat down and crossed her legs and asked what this was all about. My father placed the spreadsheet on the table between them, and he didn't yell because his voice stayed calm and almost gentle, which somehow made it more devastating when he said, "Linda, I welcomed you into my family and I gave your recommendations, jobs in my company, because I trusted my daughter's happiness, and you used that trust like a weapon." Linda's composure cracked for just a second, and long enough for me to see something underneath the warmth I had believed in for 9 years. Then she straightened her jacket and said I was protecting my son's interests because everything I did was for Daniel's future. That sentence told me everything, since she had never once seen me as her daughter, but instead had seen me as an asset and a bridge to my father's company and Daniel. Daniel had known maybe not everything, but enough, and he had said nothing because staying quiet benefited him. We terminated all 27 employees within the month, and my father restructured his entire hiring and information security process. Then he filed a civil suit against a rival company for corporate espionage, and the case eventually settled for a substantial sum, which was enough to remind everyone in that industry that trust broken this deliberately comes with consequences. But the real turning point for me wasn't the lawsuit, and it wasn't even the money, because it was the moment I stopped blaming myself for not seeing it sooner, since for years I carried a quiet guilt, thinking if I had been sharper or more suspicious, I could have protected my father and my daughter and myself. But manipulation like this isn't caught by suspicion because it's caught by truth eventually surfacing, and truth has its own timeline. One that doesn't care how much pain we carry while we wait for it. The divorce that once felt like the collapse of my entire life became the very thing that saved my father's company and freed me from a family built on quiet, calculated deception. Because sometimes the ending we're most afraid of is actually the door we needed opened. Today, Emma is 10 and she spends her weekends at my father's warehouse wearing a tiny hard hat to sizes too big, while learning that a business built on honesty is worth more than one built on convenient relationships. And my father trusts again, but differently now. Carefully and deliberately, the way trust should always be given. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: love and loyalty should never be assumed just because someone shares your holidays or calls you family, since real trust is proven slowly through consistency, not performance. And if you ever feel that quiet unease in your chest, that voice telling you something doesn't add up, listen to it, because sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we understand the least. If this story moved you, and if it reminded you that clarity often comes disguised as heartbreak, then subscribe for more real emotional stories about family and betrayal and the strength it takes to rebuild. Because the next story might just be the one that helps you see your own life a little more clearly.